very good morning to everyone. And this is a special lecture in the Creative Writing in Practice course that we have been doing. And we've been having a regular series of lectures from creative writers talking about their own experience of writing, talking about their works, their inspirations, their processes. This is the fourth and final special lecture in this series that we have been having as part of this course. And I'm very happy to have Gujarati writer Ajay Sarvaiya here with us. So let me first introduce Ajay, and then, of course, it will be over to him to talk about fiction and reality, which is his chosen topic of discussion for today. So Ajay, born in 1975, Mumbai, has been involved in creative writing in Gujarati for more than 2 decades. His poetry collection, Aam Hovun, I'm sorry about my Gujarati pronunciation, I must say, has been published recently. His short story collection, Fact and Fiction, Ane Biji Vaartaao, which won the Gujarati Sahitya Parishad Award, consists of experimental fiction in the tradition of Borges, Calvino, and Vila-matas. His fiction and poems are translated into English, Hindi, Marathi, Maithili, and Malayalam. His collection of critical essays, I'm very interested in this one, on Borges in Gujarati, breaks boundaries between fiction and criticism and provides fresh frameworks and approaches to understand language, culture, and art. He studied at St. Xavier's College, Mumbai, and the Maharaja Sayajirao University of Baroda, Vadodara. He teaches linguistics at the Maharaja Sayajirao University of Vadodara, and he's pursuing his PhD in the area of cognitive semantics and Bollywood. Just before we sort of give it over to Ajay for his talk, again, I'm very keen generally on vernacular writers in India and how various vernacular traditions in different languages interact with one another and also interact with the Indian English tradition of writing. We've had both, writers of Indian English literature and Gujarati writers, vernacular writers, Bengali writers, in this course. So it will be very interesting from a personal point of view, and I'm sure for students as well, to discuss this, the complexity of Indian literary traditions, the sheer multiplicity of that. And as an academic, as a trained linguist, how does that academic training, or does it at all have any purchase on the creative practice of a writer? This is again something that I'm particularly interested in when it comes to Ajay's practice as a literary writer. So with that, I give it over to Ajay, and thank you very much for at least virtually coming to the event.
Okay, thank you, Arko. Am I audible? Yeah. Okay, I'll share the screen, and I'll read so that I don't digress much. And I hope my screen is visible.
Yes, it is.
Okay. So, okay, let me. So that I'll read so that I can complete the whole talk in, say, 30-35 minutes, so that afterwards we have some time for discussion, and then we can pick up these themes and have some discussion. So, as I said, I would like to thank Dr. Arko Chattopadhyay and Dr. Nishan Choksi for inviting me to deliver a talk. I will talk about a few of my stories based on the themes of books, reading, and library, published in the short story collection Fact and Fiction and Biji Vaartaao. The book was published in Gujarati. However, the translations used here are by Mona Parak and Bhageshri Trivedi. Along with discussing a few stories from this collection, I will also reflect on the nature of story, plot, writing, and reading. If you have time, then I will read 2 poems on library, translated by Sachin Ketkar, and reflect on the nature of or categorization of poems. Okay. So let us look at a few stories first. In the story title, it does not have a beginning. A boy likes a book from a library and reads it repeatedly. He realizes that a sentence of the book changes every day. Later, a paragraph changes, then a page, then a chapter. He doesn't want to miss out on these changes, so before the library would close, he would hide that book among other books. Every day he would change the hiding spot. In the same way, he would change the spot of reading. He would worry, what if someone else borrowed the book? What if there was a day off at the library? He once suddenly feels that the changes in the book must not have begun with a sentence. Not that in the beginning everything was all right, in place, and then at some moment a sentence changed, and then a paragraph, then a page, then a chapter. Maybe it was like this since the beginning. That is, it must have been constantly changing. Some words, and before that, some letters, or simply a comma. He must have realized it much later. It dawns upon him later that gradually the entire book will change completely. But that isn't the end of the story. The book will constantly keep changing. That is, it will no longer remain a definite book that he liked. I will not tell you what happens next. Uh, in the story, read not this story in autumn. A girl, in order to ward off her loneliness, reads. She could not read at home, so she would read in the library. She considers reading the most non-violent way to ward off her loneliness. She once realizes that something disappears from the book that she is reading. At times, a few paragraphs disappear. At other times, a complete chapter. And then sometimes an entire character would vanish. After repeated readings, she realizes that nothing is really lost. Rather, every reading unfolds a new story. She even gets bothered by the idea that the book is waning day by day. She starts wondering whether the book has been diminishing because she is reading it. Would it stop if she stops reading it? Or would it keep on diminishing even in her absence? Would the book continue diminishing even if someone else were to read it? At what point would this diminishing stop? I'll not tell you what happens next. Okay. In the story, would you like to have a coffee? A reader gets invited by a character of a book that he is reading. As the character gets out of the book, the reader is trapped in the book. The character who is searching for her lost husband gets in touch with the girlfriend of the reader. The character asks for money and some books from the girlfriend in return of the book that has trapped her boyfriend. Now, if the girl enters the book, then her boyfriend can get out, as you can only replace a character in a book. And if she doesn't enter the book, she can only wait. So in any which way, she loses him. What happens next? Okay. You might be wondering about the strangeness of these stories. Some readers even ask, what do these stories mean? Why such stories? Are they stories? In fact, it is very difficult to define what is not a story. Humans have the ability to combine two signs to communicate. It is a remarkable ability to combine two or more meaningless sounds to create meaningful words, to combine two or more words to create sentences, to combine two or more sentences to create stories or narratives. It has been argued that the ability to use linguistic science is species specific and therefore is genetically hardwired. Similarly, the ability to tell stories or construct narratives is also considered genetically hardwired. Western philosophical tradition, following Aristotle, distinguishes between language of communication and language of literature. It assumes that the language of communication is devoid of figures of speech, or that language is literal, whereas the language of literature consists of creative use of figures of speech. It also assumes that the figures of speech found in the language of communication are borrowed from the language of literature. However, the study of the ordinary communicative language in last few decades have shown that language is not literal, that it consists of figures of speech, and that the figures of speech used in the literary language are influenced by the ones found in the ordinary language. In order to understand abstract states, emotions, and ideas, the ordinary language uses conceptual cognitive structures like conceptual metaphors, conceptual metonyms, image schema, etc. It is important to understand that one's assumptions about the nature of language affect one's assumptions about the nature of literature. I will discuss certain assumptions about the nature of language and how they affect one's assumptions about the nature of literature. Conceptual metaphors have also been used over centuries to study literature. So one of such metaphors is language is structure. If we adopt this metaphor, then we focus on formal patterns, style, techniques, etc. A story is conceptualized as a set of events with causal relations among these events. So plot and different techniques of storytelling become important because language is viewed as a structure, a system of formal patterns devoid of any purpose. The metaphor of structure gives rise to assumptions that art is useless, or art is play, lila, or art does not have any purpose. There is another assumption related to these ones, and that is art is entertainment. Entertainment also does not have any purpose. It is also useless. This metaphor puts forward an interesting notion of art, which emphasizes the use of techniques and style. On the other hand, if we adopt the metaphor language is action to study literature, then it opens up new possibilities. Language assumed to be a medium of communication or dialogue, a means to establish and strengthen social relations, or a tool to resolve day-to-day problems. Also, we use language to suggest, refer, thank, apologize, advise, order, request, name, invite, etc. These acts cannot be performed in the absence of the medium of language. The British philosopher J.L. Austin calls such linguistic acts as speech acts. Literature is also a speech act, and like other speech acts, it cannot be performed in the absence of language. If we consider literature as action or function, then it serves many purposes, such as communication, dialogue, entertainment, information dissemination, knowledge production, etc. Because literature is a complex object, it can incorporate many functions. If one focuses on a particular function, then that does not nullify other functions. And if one deals with a particular metaphor to study literature, that also does not nullify other metaphors. Literature being an abstract phenomenon, it invites as many metaphors as we are capable of. Writing fiction is about doing something with reality. Caroline Levine uses the metaphor of thought experiments for fictional writing, especially experimental. Harold Bloom puts forward an interesting thesis that stories are written in either Chekhovian or Borgesian way. The Chekhovian method distinguishes between the word and the word, between facts and fiction. It assumes that the world is real and fiction is unreal. Fiction tries to understand or describe the world. This method uses the metaphor of mirror. Fiction reflects the world. Fiction is a report. The problem is Chakraborty's neither question the nature of reality nor the nature of fiction. The Borgesian method does not distinguish between the world of facts and the world of fiction. Both are regarded as constructions, and therefore illusion or labyrinth or make-believe. Both are equally real or unreal. The reality of the world is no different or is not separate from the reality of writing or reading. The reality is not assumed to be out there, which can be captured inside a story through writing or reading. Reality is not a steady, definite piece, but it keeps changing, emerging, evolving. Fiction too is not a definite piece ready for consumption. It also keeps changing, emerging, evolving. The stories discussed above belong to the Borgesian tradition. In one of the long stories of the book, Borges appears as a character, and and Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh also appears as a character. And in one of the articles of the book which Arco mentioned, Borges and who, book of critical essays, Borges and who, which means Borges and I. So Borges has written a story titled Borges and I, where Borges meets himself in an Argentine in a hotel in Buenos Aires. So I happened to meet him in that hotel. Okay, so that's what I construct in one of the articles, and later on I used him as a character in this group. Okay. In Gujarati literary tradition, there is an interesting distinction being made between experience and reading. Reading is not considered an experience. Similarly, experience is not considered a reading. And therefore, experimental writing of Borgesian type is marginal, it's minority. It's considered as if it's not work of fiction. Okay. There is another set of stories in the book that experiment with one pertinent theme. What happens when two individuals come together? What could possibly happen? What are the different possibilities? So two individuals come together, interact, and discuss. During the course of this interaction, they talk about their favorite poets, novelists, painters, filmmakers. They do not end up understanding each other, but remain ambiguous or ununderstandable, even if they love each other. None of their trouble or conflict or complexity gets resolved, as if they are together but distant from each other, in each other's company but lonely, in each other's embrace but somewhere else. Being together does not provide any sense of security or closure or achievement. The action in these stories consists of two characters come together like two atoms. There is some friction, some noise, and then they depart or disperse. In such a pattern, plot doesn't play much of a role because the story does not move from an event to another event, where there is some causal connection between these events. Plot requires movement. Plot requires causation. What if there is no plot? What if there is no beginning, middle, and end? A story then becomes a movement from sentence to utterance, from description to emotion, from sensation to thought, from insight to awareness. In these stories, plot is not important, causation is not important, as characters in the stories do not want to reach somewhere, do not want to achieve something, do not have to solve a mystery, do not have to prove anything. As the characters become aware, the readers also become aware about happiness, thought, relations, existence, loneliness, and so on. I call it the third method of writing fiction, Nirmal Verma method, where the texture of the story is woven through ambiguity, where definiteness of plot is absent, where the mood of the character sets the tone of the story. The story derives insights from banal situations. Thus, it leads to awareness. What James Wall notes about French film director François Truffaut also applies to the art of fiction of the third method. Truffaut is suggesting that life is not a plot to be described, but an existence to be revealed. That life is filled with inconsequential events, and that to live is to be exposed to these events. Common sense drives us to view the world, life, reality through causation. We therefore connect one event with another event. Therefore, an event is important. Its beginning, middle, and end are important. Plot is important. So to reach somewhere, to achieve something becomes important. But if we view the world, reality, or fiction as plotless, then a possibility of awareness emerges. Like a plotless story, there is no finality or closure to awareness. Okay, now if we have time, then I can read.
Sure, absolutely. Please go ahead.
So, because the stories that we talked about also about library, reading books. So I had written a few poems on library, so I thought I would share them. This is the first one of the three. I'll read two at least. The title is Your Solitude. Nobody can make out if you are hungry when you are in the library. You may have been sitting here for ages. No one looks at you for long. Your medical history, your address, your visiting card, or your habits, your honesty or excuses do not mean much here. Nobody bothers if you sneeze or cough. Excuse me. Yes.
Sorry about that. I think someone got unmuted. Anyway, no problem. Please go ahead.
Oh. Your presence means nothing to the people passing by you in the library. The words on the pages lead people's feelings, not the reader's behavior. The library doesn't care about your caste or creed, your class or your fame, your identity or your reality. It doesn't even care who you are or what you want to be. The library only accepts your solitude, nothing else. Okay, one more. 2. You are not being. Thankfully, you don't have to take your shoes off outside before entering the library. You don't have to put a tilak on your forehead. You don't have to pray. You can even enter the library with a sense of being wrecked. Thankfully, you don't have to climb mountains to enter the library. Please, people, to keep bouquets ready for felicitation. You can leave all the ambition at the door like an umbrella and enter the library. As you can sit as if, and you can sit as if you are a hand of a clock or a line on a page, or you simply doesn't exist. So I'll stop here. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so that leaves us actually with a lot of time for discussion, which is wonderful. So, I mean, if I may start the conversation, I was just wondering about the interaction in this case between the Indian traditions of writing and the transnational traditions, to put it like that. You know, in this case, Borges, of course. And when you write these stories, is there any conscious attempt to contextualize them somehow in an Indian tradition? In the third method that you opened up, you were talking about a more, let's say, a more slightly more realistic tradition, which in a way comes from the Indian tradition, like, I mean, to put it like that. So I was just wondering, in terms of let's say, an Indian I'm not saying necessarily an adaptation. It could also be a subversion of this magical realist tradition. Again, it's a label, and the label itself is a bit reductive, but that's how usually Borges and others have been received in that label. So I'm just wondering, whether as a writer located in Gujarat and specifically, in a particular place, if there is a certain contextual or transcontextual addition that happens to this, of course, global tradition of writing, someone like Borges. So that's the first thing I was like curious about. Yeah.
Okay. So see, I'll answer in a personal fashion and contextualize it in the literary tradition in Gujarat. So see, like we when we were reading when we were young, so at the modernist period, so Suresh Joshi, Madurai, and Radheshyam Sharma, and all sorts of modernists, so they were writing experimental fiction, experimental poetry, and everything. So, and then like simultaneously, I also observed that whenever I am interacting with my friends, whoever I meet, I'm just talking about the writers and filmmakers and artists. So I thought, why not write stories about them? Okay. So I was not conscious about the whole Borgesian genre. Okay, now it's become a genre. Okay, it's not just a method. So I was not even aware. I was, frankly speaking, I wasn't even aware about Roberto Bolaño or Enrique Vila-matas at that time. So I just thought about it and I started writing. Okay, let's write the way we live, and most of my friends were. So then that's how I started creating fiction. But I was in a different period. I was not in the modern period. Okay, by that time, postmodernism had begun. By that time, again the realism, naturalism had come back. Okay, the political awareness had come back. Okay, in a different way, social awareness, same thing, but in a different mode. So again the Chekhovian model came back in Gujarat, and I kept writing, and in few groups I got admired, but there are like two opposite views about my writing. So in one seminar that I got to hear about, one critic went to the extent of saying that Ajay doesn't know how to write stories. And in the same seminar, another critic explained all the aesthetic points of my story. And he even uh, invented a term, Sahitya, because my characters talk about literature and cinema and painting. So later on, I came across the term in Enrique Vila-matas, where he talks about literature sickness. And he gives it a term, Montano's Melody. Okay, one of his novels name is Montano's Melody. So he terms it as a sickness. So it came later, but I'm in the margin because I don't know how to write Chekhovian fiction. And because of that, this trouble is there. And even in the past, like even in the modernist period, there were few writers, very fine, Kishore Jadhav and all. So once like Suresh Joshi passed away, the whole modernist period was on decline. So some critics started attacking, okay, Kishore Jadhav, Suresh Joshi, and all the experimental writers. And so the same attack was forwarded, but not in that fashion against me. Okay, they speak, but they don't write against me. They speak, but don't write. Okay. And I also saw these poems as an extension. Okay, that see, it is very difficult to categorize poetry in modernist period. Frankly speaking, see, if you were say in 1950s, you would read say poetry in rhyme, meter, and all that. So you have some notion of poetry. But say in modern period, like you have free verse. Okay, the central, what we call prototypical poetry is free verse, or you also have prose poems, you also have narrative poems, And then and see, even if you look at Louis Gluck's whole collection, there is there is not a single poem in rhyme, I suppose, or there could be one or two here and there. But if you look at even Neruda and all sorts of people, or say even Vasco Popa, okay, we don't find any poetry in rhyme. They must have written in rhyme, but they could translate it in previous probably. We don't know. But for us, so when we started writing, we got question like, why don't you use meter? I said that's not poetry for us. So that's peripheral now. What is central is free verse. So those kinds of issues, okay, how do we categorize? So how do we categorize fiction? So again, like now, what was in the best, say the whole Chekhovian say model was in periphery in modernist period in Gujarat, but that has come to center. And what was experimental, what was in the center, has now gone into best. So writers like me are now in periphery. So people tell me that we understand your poems, we don't understand your fiction. Okay, now I'm like, okay, what do I do?
Yeah, it kind of goes back to, yeah, sorry, go ahead, please. Yeah.
So it's not, nothing was conscious on my part. All these things were written later as a reflection when I was told to talk about my work and all that. And I had also written about Nirmal Verma. Right. So then I conceptualized these things at a later stage. So when I was writing, I had no such, I just wanted to contribute in a different way. I just wanted to put a different reality in front of people. That okay, reading is also an experience. Okay. And reading can change you. Okay. It's not that only खेती बाड़ी करने से ही experience नहीं बनता, right? Because that's what people think over here. So if you're a farmer, you are a better writer.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, I mean, many of these discussions, and especially the way you were talking about the positioning of experimental writing within the Gujarati tradition, made me the general debates that have almost always been there. Is modernism a politically committed literary tradition? What are the political commitments of modernism? And a lot of attack on modernism has been centered, especially in India, around this assumption that, you know, South Asian literature has to be political in a certain committed way, and formal experimentation derails that political commitment. So there are all kinds of slightly simplistic assumptions about what form does. I mean, formal experiment can go hand in hand with political commitment as well, which is something that becomes a little bit difficult for at least a large literary orthodoxy to understand.
Yes.
So there's a certain reaction. Right.
You have put it in a wonderful manner. And see, even say Suresh Joshi or Madurai Tour, they were also socially committed, and there were certain political commitments there. Okay, when I'm writing, those things are also, there are undercurrents about current political situation world over, if not India, all over. So, but there is that close reading or the whole tradition of interpreting. That is now some criticism, those things are missing. And there are certain other, say, socio-political reasons because of which we have a very, very kind of not so interesting kind of critical tradition in Gujarat. Even all the experiments made by, say, Kundera, okay, and how can we say that he is not politically committed? Okay, so and that's what the readers have to find. What kind of political alternative is being put here? And that's what is missing actually. They want clear-cut, okay, association between left-right, okay. And Kundera says there is a third politics, and that is, so I'm not rightist. He says I'm not rightist, I'm not leftist, I'm a novelist. And imagine he says this is politics. So irony, say truth in terms of irony, truth in terms of paradox. So allow that space. So that's very difficult actually in our times, especially. So, and
Yeah. I just had one
all
last
these
question,
things
and
are,
maybe sorry, please go ahead. Yeah, yeah. No, no, please
probably
go
all
ahead.
these. So it's very. We see now very vehement kind of attitude of the readers or audience all over because of social media and the certain kind of political awareness. Uh, but in our say literary tradition, I saw that coming a long back, that they had started attacking experimental writers.
Yeah.
They were putting forward a different reality in front of you, and you don't want to read it. They want to put it aside.
Mm.
So they want something convenient. So I don't know. Maybe I attempt certain convenient things in future if possible. But
I just
then,
had one last quick question. I know others might have questions after this, so I'll not take up more time. But since in the bio, I got to know that you have a connection with Bombay, so I was just wondering whether the Arun Kolatkar sort of Bombay poets who had a very strong connection with European modernists as well, whether that has had some sort of an influence on your writing.
it's not directly okay because Kolatkar, say even Vinda Karanjikar and others
Mm.
who are being translated into Gujarati, Dilip Chitra was being translated into Gujarati. So we used to read them. And then in English also, of course. So those kinds of readings were always there. But I always saw, say, Kundera, Borges and Nirmal Verma as major influences, actually. Uh, and that's how, like, I see myself. Uh,
Yeah.
and of course, like, we used to attend Kolatkar's reading in Mumbai, and even the group with which I'm involved. So uh, we used to have writers' workshops every year, and Bhupen Thakkar, Ghulam Mohammad Sheikh, Atul Dodia, okay, all sorts of people used to come and read their work. Okay, so if I was just 18-year-old, and those people were Bhupen Thakkar was there, and I was 18-year-old reading my work. So all sorts of things. Okay, so Mumbai gave that edge. Okay, definitely, in that context, you're right.
Thank you so much. That's very rich.